Good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. Simon and Jude Speaker Series, Saying No and Letting Go. We are featuring Rabbi Edwin Goldberg. Rabbi Goldberg is with Congregation Beth Shalom in the Woodlands. Rabbi Goldberg received his ordination and doctorate from Hebrew literature, in Hebrew literature from the Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute in Religion in 1989 and 1994, respectively. He enjoys a large spectrum of rabbi duties and activities from teaching and pastoral care, as well as teaching at Lone Star Community College, and also creating a deep opportunities for spiritual engagement. He's also an author of many books. Tonight, we turn this great opportunity of saying no and letting go. Also, just a commercial for you, Rabbi Goldberg's book is available on Amazon, and he will also open up the opportunity to speak with him after he gives his talk on his book. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Marie. I'm so delighted to be asked for this invitation, or given this invitation, to speak about something very close to my heart. And even though this book was written a few years ago, I think for me personally, it's become very timely in this past year of pandemic. And you might agree as we go through what I'm talking about. I do have some of a PowerPoint to share, so I'm going to open that up and hopefully people can see it. And I apologize that we are not able to do this in person yet. We wanted to originally, but part of saying no and letting go is saying no so you can make room for what matters most, which is actually the whole name of my book, Saying No and Letting Go, Jewish Wisdom on Making Room for What Matters Most. And there is a Jewish notion that I'm going to teach you tonight called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum, which means many things, but I like to translate it colloquially as doing more with less. And hopefully that will become clear as we work through this concept. Here's the book, yes, Saying No and Letting Go. And let me start by talking about something that you might think is not particularly religious unless you really like beer. There is a restaurant, I came to know it in Miami, it's in other places too, called World of Beer. Now, what's interesting about World of Beer is it's a place that you go if you like beer. Well, that's not the interesting part, of course. What's interesting is what you get there and what you don't get there. When you go to World of Beer, you sit down and you order beer, and they have a lot of beer. Pretty much any beer you'd want, they have. But then if you get hungry and you want something to eat, they have no food. Now, you may say, this is crazy. How can you have a restaurant that serves beer and has no food? But that's okay. The one I used to go to in Miami, you could sit outside most of the year, is Miami, and they didn't have food, but they had these menus, and you had your cell phone, and the menus were restaurants right there in walking distance, and all you had to do was use your cell phone and call and order the food you wanted. If you had 4 people in your party, you could call 4 different restaurants. Everyone could be happy. Someone wants Chinese, someone wants, sushi. It's all good. And then the people from those restaurants would bring into World of Beer their food. And there was a relationship with World of Beer and these restaurants. The idea was you don't have to do everything. And I thought this was incredible because what's it really saying is World of Beer decided to limit what it did to just beer, but opened itself up, therefore, for other companies to do other things. And what's ironic a bit is the fact that World of Beer, of course, has the name world in it. So I guess here's an example of a bar, here's an example of a restaurant. And it's neither, it's something new. World of Beer has the word world in it, and world implies totality. But this Jewish theme that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, which was created about 500 years ago, suggests that when God created the world, God could not have human beings have any free will or any space to do anything unless God contracted God's self in something that's called tzimtzum. God narrowed God's self, as it were, so there could be space for us to exist. And there was a movie that came out a few years ago based on a great book, Life of Pi, by Jan Martel. And if you can see the name of the ship that sinks towards the beginning of the movie, it's called Tzimtzum, which is very interesting. It's not a Jewish story. No one in the story is Jewish, and yet Jan Martel wanted to name the ship that sinks Tzimtzum. There has to be something there. So the idea of Tzimtzum can be explained as this notion that when God created the world, you can see the world is represented by this circle, God had to make God's self very small so we could exist within. This was a very important way for creation to happen. And the man who created this 400, 500 years ago, Rabbi Isaac Luria in the 16th century, devised this theory in order to explain why there is bad things in the world and why there's good things, why there's free choice. Because if God created everything and ran everything, that's not something that could exist. And so I love this concept, but what does it have to do with the book I wrote? Just by the way, if you're not familiar, Rabbi Isaac Luria was called the Lion of the Kabbalah. So I'm now introducing a new term, Kabbalah. Kabbalah means that which is received. It means mystical tradition in Judaism. It can refer to many different texts over centuries. But when we talk about Rabbi Luria's Kabbalah, which again is from Sfat in the mystical part of northern Israel and writing in the 16th century, when we're talking about the Lurianic Kabbalah, we're specifically talking about this notion of Tzimtzum, of God reducing God's self so that there could be existence. This is what I'm showing you here is the tree of Kabbalah that shows in Hebrew God's different personalities, God's different aspects. But the idea is most of these are hidden away so we can have free will and do what we want. So I guess it was in the back of my mind when a few years ago I heard a talk from someone at the Kellogg School of Management of Northwestern University in Chicago, where I was studying a little bit, because even rabbis and ministers, you know, we do to some extent run things to some extent in partnership with lay people and other professionals, and it's good to have a little business background. But someone who was speaking said something that I just couldn't let go of. I couldn't say no. She said, the essence of strategy is denial. I mean, I stopped, I said, what? And I asked very politely, what is that? And she said, the essence of strategy is denial. You can have no plan, you can have no strategy, you can't do anything unless you're prepared to say no to many other things. And I just couldn't let that idea go away. And I started thinking of all the ways it could apply to us and how our lives might be different if we took that idea seriously, saying no, creating space, tzimtzum, just like God does, according to the Kabbalah, so that we could have a more fulfilling life. And so I started thinking about examples where that's difficult. I'm sure you've been in a conversation where everyone's talking at the same time. I'm sure many of us, myself included, are not necessarily good at the fine art of listening, because especially when we're anxious, it seems like we want to talk. Everyone wants to talk. But what's it like if you can stop talking? If you can say no to that impulse to just talk and let someone else talk? That's a kind of tzimtzum. There's a famous story that when Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone were both neck and neck for the role of Prime Minister of England back in the 19th century. During the same week before the decision was made, both men on different nights had dinner with a young woman. And afterwards, the young woman was asked for her thoughts about the two different dinners. And she said, after dining with Mr. Gladstone, she came away thinking that he was the smartest man in England. But after dining with Mr. Disraeli, she came away thinking she was the smartest woman in England. Gladstone knew how to talk. Disraeli knew how to listen, to practice not talking too much, to create a space for his dinner companion. And Disraeli won the election, by the way. Although both eventually, of course, served as prime minister. We all know Victoria considered Disraeli her favorite. Another example of tzimtzum that came to me the last few years was a teacher of mine in Jerusalem, Avigdor Shinan, Hebrew University. And he once said to me something that at first I didn't understand. He said, a good educator cheats. And I said, you mean like plagiarizes? He said, no, a good educator doesn't share everything that he or she knows. You get up to talk, you don't have to share everything. You have to hold back and just talk about what's really important. Because if you start sharing everything, you're really not letting people be engaged. And that's tough. You know, we rabbis who write sermons, often we have to cut things we don't want to cut because we don't want to be too long. And also we probably are trying to say too much, but it's hard. It's almost like the artist, you know, some artists just take clay and create something. Other artists chip away at the block of stone and take most of the stone away, and whatever's left, that's the art. But that must be hard, of course. I mentioned a great mystical sage of Judaism of the 16th century, Isaac Luria, but there's also some Hasidic later sages from Poland and thereabouts who were able to create a different kind of mysticism that played on this as well. And one of the most famous is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, talking about saying no and letting go. He's represented with an empty chair. And the reason is, unlike other dynasties, when Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav died, he did not leave an heir. And instead of appointing someone, his followers, to this day, and they're still around, decided the best way to honor him was to not have any more rebbes. There's no rebbe in the Bratslav movement except their rebbe. And so they have an empty chair to represent his teaching. For them, they needed to say no to new leaders so they could hold on to the memory of their leader. One of the things that we have in another tradition that I greatly respect, the Zen Buddhist tradition, is a kohen. Now in Judaism, if you say a kohen, it means a priest, but a kohen is one of these unsolvable enigmas designed to break your brain. The most famous one perhaps is we know the sound of two hands clapping, but what's the sound of one hand clapping? And yet I also think that this is an amazing concept when it comes to tzimtzum, or saying no and letting go, because there is something about tzimtzum that is somewhat Zen-ish. After all, if Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the famous empty chair rabbi, taught us that God is everywhere, then we could ask, if God fills the entire universe, how can we be somewhere? God's everywhere, how can we be somewhere? And the answer is, of course, that God removed God's self from creation so that we could exist. And yet, the rabbis of that generation still taught that God is still everywhere. So it's a paradox, it's a kohen, or maybe it implies that somehow part of God is within us. Rabbi Nachman said famously that there is no empty space devoid of God, and yet it must be empty for us to exist. And if you had asked Rabbi Nachman, how do you resolve that contradiction? He probably would have said, we don't know, but when the Messiah comes, we'll ask. Until then, we have to do the best we can. So some of the things that I take away when it comes to tzimtzum practically are some tough choices. Now this one here, I don't need to make a trigger alert, I don't think, but it's a little bit of a strange idea. This is the best graphic I could find. There is something in Silicon Valley called, in fact, Steve Jobs was very, very famous for this, called, and I apologize, it's a little gruesome, knifing the baby. There we are. And it simply means when you're in a project, it's not really a baby, there's no knife, but when you're on a project and you have this plan what to do, and Steve Jobs is very good at this, you have to get rid of everything else, right? So if you look at an iPhone, iPhones, traditionally didn't have a lot. They were designed originally pretty simply because Steve Jobs felt everything else that you could find on an Android phone, you don't need. And so we're not going to have it. Even if you really want it, it's not the essence. They call it knifing the baby. It's very memorable. But when it comes to our decisions, and if we want to practice what is now being called essentialism, we find out what is the essence and we get rid of everything else, it can be pretty hard sometimes. Also, sometimes it's hard to live with other people's comments. George Washington was known as a young man for being very brave. When he would fight in the French and Indian War, he was known for having bullets whiz by his head, and he would keep leading the troops. No one ever thought he was a coward. And yet during the Revolutionary War, he often, quite often, chose not to fight. There would be a battle brewing with the British, and he would sneak away with his troops and not fight. And after a while, of course, people started saying, what happened to this general? Why is he shying away from fights? But he had learned a lesson in history from generals in the past in his situation who could not lose a battle. You know, if George Washington wins the war, we're Americans. If George Washington loses one battle, we still have British accents. It's as simple as that. And so he kept saying no with great pressure on him because he could not fight until it was the right fight. And history, of course, will judge him well. Another way, by the way, we can say no by choosing our battles, is another way to put it, is the technological wonders that we have in our hands and on our desktops and our laptops, learning to turn them off. Now, Jewish tradition, of course, has the seventh day, and Shabbat is our time traditionally for Orthodox Jews, of course, to have no electronics on. But I would even argue for liberal Jews like myself and our congregation, Friday night through Saturday night is a time to maybe turn the phone off if you can, or at least turn the ringer off, or at least don't check it so much. Try to make something different. I once, years ago, gave a sermon about the Sabbath and how important it was. And I created for everyone, and this was a Rosh Hashanah sermon, so there was a lot of people, maybe 1,000 people. I created every couple or every family got a box, a little box they could put together. And I said, on Friday night, you can put in whatever you need to put in so you can be there, be present. You say no and let go. You make room for what matters most. Half the people in the receiving line afterwards told me that was the silliest idea. Why would they want something like that? And the other half thought it was the best idea they'd ever heard of. And to my sadness, most of those people were married to each other, the two sides. It's not easy saying no at first, but it can feel great. Sometimes I love taking walks here in the woodlands. Sometimes I take a walk without my phone. And I feel a little weird about it, what happens if there's a crisis, but I also feel relieved. Now, most of us don't go to circuses, especially these days. But one of the things that is a stereotype of circuses, and I want you to think about this, is the lion tamer. And when you see a classic lion tamer, he always goes in with a gun, hopefully he won't need it, with a whip, of course, and a chair. Why would a lion tamer need a chair with four, in this case, it's always got to be the chair, and it always has to have the four bottom parts facing the lion, or it's worthless. What's the chair for? The chair is because a lion cannot focus and be the gruesome lion he has to be when he's looking at four different points. It completely distracts him. He cannot focus. That's a secret of lion tamers. And wow, how often are we guilty of not being able to focus? It's like someone has a chair in front of our face and we don't know it. So tzimtzum, saying no and letting go, is this opportunity to take away. I like to say that the takeaway of my talk is take away. Take away all the things that help us lose focus, and whatever's left is what matters. One of the stories I repeat in my book that was told first by Jim Collins of the book Good to Great. It may have been actually a sequel. Anyway, he tells a story in 1996. There was a group of hikers who famously or infamously died at the top of Mount Everest. And they did so because there was a freak storm that happened and they were caught at the top. Hillary Step is a very dangerous, but it's a very narrow place, and they just couldn't get down and up in time because of this freak storm, and they died. Famous book about it by John Krakauer, made into a movie. But what is less known is there was an IMAX crew that was supposed to be filming all of this, and none of them had any problem. Because on the day of the ascents, their coach, their guide said to the group, look, we've spent millions of dollars. Everyone wants to do this. There's only one rule. It's a beautiful day. Everything's going to be great, probably. If we're not at the very top at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we turn around and go back to camp. Now, I'm not telling you this because it's a conditional thing. Maybe it'll be 2:30. We'll move it to 2:30. No, Maybe the weather's good, but not great. No, I'm telling you, no matter what, it doesn't matter. At 2 o'clock, if we are not at the top, we turn around. And sure enough, at 2 o'clock, it was beautiful out, but he made them turn around. There was a lot of grumbling. And then the freak storm happened, and the IMAX folks were fine because they had turned around. And to me, this is the most dramatic example I can give of tzimtzum, of saying no and letting go. I am sure those folks really were upset that they weren't going up to the top, but they needed at that moment to follow their leader who knew better than to play around with the mountain. And so, my friends, I've got to tell you, there are times in life when you're going to have a 2 o'clock. You may not know it yet. Maybe you have already done it and you just didn't know what it was. Maybe it's a relationship with someone who is just abusive enough that you can't deal with it anymore because they're always going to have an excuse. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it could be many things. But and it can't be, if everything is 2 o'clock, nothing is 2 o'clock. So you got to be discreet about it. But there will be times when it's a 2 o'clock moment. And if you don't turn around and go back down the mountain, you're going to regret it. By the way, the IMAX movie was made because they brought a lot of supplies with them, and so they could wait out the storm and then go back up again. So it's always good to have a plan as well. Oh yes, Great by Choice. That's the name of the book that recounts this story. The last thing I want to share with you as far as the PowerPoint is something from today's Wall Street Journal, just to show that this concept is so occurrent, I think. The title of the headline, "After the COVID vaccine, people find joy in little things." The idea being there is so much that we cannot do right now, partly because nothing's open. I mean, many things aren't open, partly because it's not safe. And so the things that we do, we should take great joy in. And the things that we can't do, when we can do them, they don't have to be big things to give us joy. Maybe it's just chatting with a neighbor that we haven't been able to do. In the article, someone talks about checking all the tomatoes in the store. Someone talks about, doing things like a walk in the park that they cannot do now. We're lucky that most of us can do that now here in the woodlands. No blizzards today. So again, one of the things a pandemic can do is remind us what really matters, and nothing else but that matters. And of course, the other great example of saying no and letting go right now is a mask, right? For those who don't want to wear a mask because it's uncomfortable, and I get it, I totally do. To me, that's a great example of, if you wear the mask, you're saying no to a freedom, but you're making room for what matters most, which is health down the road. So it seems to me, and maybe you'll find this too, that the more we think about this concept of saying no and letting go, the more that we're able to make decisions, important ones. After I wrote the book, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of England, I saw a quote he said, which was so good. He said, "Leadership is about saying no. Anyone can say yes." So it doesn't mean we always say no all the time, but we say no a lot. So when we say yes, it is so powerful and so affirming. And we're not God, but I think in that way we can be like God. If God made tzimtzum, if God created space for the world, how do we create space for the world we want to see? To me, that's the reason why I wrote the book. So I hope we can open it up for comments or questions. That's my way of creating space for you all. Marie, are people allowed to unmute themselves if they want?
Yeah, I can unmute myself.
Can we unmute other people?
Yeah, we're gonna
Oh, thank you, Christine.
yeah, we're gonna unmute everybody.
Rabbi Goldberg, maybe you already shared this, but I just wanted to know what inspired you to write this book. What was kind of the driving force behind it?
Thank you. Thank you. So when I was at the Kellogg School of Management, we had some wonderful teachers which were talking about business, but so much of it related to life, synagogue life and life in general. And in a small conversation, someone connected with the School of Business said that the essence of strategy is denial. And I didn't really understand what that was. To me, that was like a Zen koan or something. And I really explored it, and it inspired me to write the book, because again, a strategy is about having a plan, but a plan is so often about what you're not going to do, if you think about it, right? I am not going to spend this money because I want to buy something later, right? And therefore, I'm going to put money aside, and I'm going to say no to all these things for something. That's not always easy to do, but it's a very important thing to do if you want to get the right thing without going broke. I'm not going to go out tonight. I'm going to study for the test because I want to pass and get a good grade, right? It's simple, and yet, I don't know, we're so distracted by so many things that to have that, I think that's a key to resilience. And I want our children to be aware of this too. So that's why.
Nothing very much. What's news with you? Have you had your second shot?
Someone else?
No bad reaction. Saturday week.
I think Rabbi, I think we're picking up somebody else. Does anyone else have any questions for Rabbi Goldberg on saying no and letting go?
Begin slowly to think about what I want to do once I've had a couple of weeks.
Okay, Christine, can you mute everybody,
I think
please?
we're okay. I muted that person, so we're good.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions?
Or comments or stories of maybe when you said no and let go?
This is Alan Friss. I have maybe a question that's slightly off topic, but it seems to be somewhat related. Can you maybe give us your view from the Jewish perspective of when you're trying to make a vital decision or an important decision, the difference between trying to determine if you really are considering God's will or is your free will taking more of the lead?
That's such a great question, and it goes to the heart of, what is God doing and what we're doing. I follow the Jewish line of thought, which says there is free will. I talked a little earlier ago about a Zen koan, which is something that doesn't seem to make sense, but maybe if you meditated on enough, it will. So there was a rabbi 2,000 years ago named Rabbi Kiba. And even though he wasn't giving a Zen koan, it sounds like one. He said, free will is given, but God knows everything that's going to happen. Free will is given. You have choices and you can make those choices. You can be good or you can be bad. It's totally up to you, but God knows what you're going to do. I mean, that doesn't seem to make sense. To me, it's like when I had word problems in math in middle school and was always so annoyed because I knew that the answer to the problem was in the back of the book, but the teacher didn't want the answer. The teacher wanted to see how I got there. So maybe that's what that is. Maybe Rabbi Kiba is saying, God is God. God knows what's going to happen, but you still have free will. And so when I'm trying to make a very difficult decision, I'll look at the different points of view and try to make a good decision. And I hope that God will favor my decision, but I don't believe that God is acting in a way that makes the decision for me. That would be against the theology I believe in. And again, I think that's pretty common in Judaism. Thank you. Throw me another question. I like good questions. Well, while you're thinking about it, I will share with you the last chapter of the book is a little difficult in that it talks about the greatest and the most difficult letting go of all, and that is death. That goes back to faith, I suppose, in a way. The great Abraham Joshua Heschel, a wonderful teacher and writer of the 20th century, said, for a pious, good person, death is a homecoming. Death is a privilege. It's not something you want to happen tomorrow, but he saw death as not the enemy. And I do think part of that is learning to let go, or maybe seeing the bigger picture. Maybe it's all part of the bigger picture. There's a story of the two waves. Maybe you've heard this in the ocean, and the little wave is is very calm, and the big wave is freaking out. And the little wave says, "What's the matter?" And the big wave says, "Well, I'm bigger than you. I can see we're about to hit the shore. We're going to cease to exist." And the little wave says, "Well, I think you're confused. We're not waves. We're the ocean." Right? So if you're able to practice Tzimtzum and limit your ego, you start realizing that God has created a space for us, and we're creating a space for God, and maybe we're more connected than we would have thought. That's really a great thing. So when it comes to death, it's fearful, but perhaps less so. And so at the end of the book, I talk about in the 1960s, Israeli author Shai Agnon won the Nobel Prize for Literature. When the news was announced, all his friends rushed to his home in Jerusalem to say Mazel Tov, congratulations. Hundreds of reporters and photographers came too. The room was filled to overflowing. One of the photographers said, "Please sit at your desk and pretend you're writing something so we can pose a picture of you that way." So Agnon sat at the desk and scribbled something on a tablet as the photographers took dozens of pictures of him posed that way. And when the people finally left, someone went and looked at the tablet. Agnon had written 5 words that come from the High Holy Day prayer book. Adam Yusodo me'afar v'sofo le'afar, or origin is dust, and dust is our end. And I say at this triumphant moment in his life, these were the words Agnon chose to remember. And I don't think he was being a downer. I don't think he was saying, "Boy, what a sad day. I remember I'm going to die." I think he was saying, "I'm mortal. This too shall pass. But the essence of who I am is there. It's not about the fame, but it is about my essence." At least that's the way I take it. And so in a way, if you practice Tzimtzum, first of all, you'll have more friends because people will like that you listen to them. You'll have a better life because you'll be doing what matters most. And perhaps you might even be a little less afraid to die. Who knows? It's worth a try anyway. That's how I look at it. Comments, questions? I have a lot of stories in the book, by the way. This is not an intellectual book. In fact, there was a rabbi who was asked to write a foreword for it, and he said, "I can't do it," or just a blurb. He said, "I can't do it. It's not a scholarly book." And I said, "Well, I guess I got that right because I wasn't writing a scholarly book."
Rabbi, in this time of COVID, when we're asking ourselves to give up a lot of things.
Yes.
How does that relate to Tzimtzum?
Yeah, thank you, Fred. I think it's key because sometimes we forget why we're giving up things. I mean, I come every Friday night to the synagogue to lead services, and almost every Friday night, I get very upset for a moment. What have I done wrong? Is it the wrong night? There's no one here. I'm used to having a full sanctuary. And then I remember why we're not having services. It's not because I enjoy being by myself or it's more convenient for the congregants to be at home. It's because we're trying to protect people's lives. We are saying no and letting go and making room for what matters most. It's a perfect example. But sometimes I have to remind myself, especially when we're almost rounding into a whole year. Tzimtzum is hard. It is a difficult thing. And if it's hard for us, it was probably even hard for God. If that is a creation myth you want to take seriously, for God to be able to contract so we have space, it's not an easy thing, and it's not easy for us. But I do think it's profound.
Rabbi, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Be interested in your Jewish take on when bad things happen to good people.
Mm-hmm. So
disabilities, things of that happen that.
Right. Well, that's a very important question. And Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a book, and you phrased it perfectly. A lot of people think the book is called Why Bad Things Happen, and it's not. I've been in his presence when he's been asked this, and he said, "I would never write a book called Why Bad Things. How do I know?" Right? I'm not going to play God. The book is called, as your question was, When Bad Things Happen. What do you do? What kind of choice do you make? And one of the choices that Jews have made since the Lurianic Kabbalah of the 16th century is to say, perhaps this is what happened. The reason why there's evil and bad things is not because God is out to get us or God is trying to punish us. It's because when God created the world and this Tzimtzum happened, this this narrowing of God's presence happened, it didn't go smoothly. And that God's essence was so strong that when God tried to keep the essence in these vessels, if you will, they couldn't hold it and they broke, they shattered. And this released evil into the world. And so the purpose of everyone, not just Jews, but everyone, is to repair these vessels so that they're whole and God's goodness and our goodness can be together. And until that happens, we're going to have evil. So that explains why bad things happen, generally, but it also gives us something we can do. We can't just say we feel bad. We can repair these vessels. And the Hebrew for this is a term that is now often associated with social justice, and that is tikkun olam. It literally means repairing the world, but it means repairing the vessels that have broken in this cosmic accident. So there are many ways in every religion to explain when bad things happen. But from a Jewish point of view, this is such a profound one. God's not out to get us, but a cosmic accident happened. And with partnership with God, through acts of goodness and piety and care and sensitivity and compassion, we can repair.
Hi, Rabbi. This is Paul, and I guess it's a comment and a partly question. One of the things I walked away from, and I survived the cancer, was how I thought of it after. And I never thought of it as being like a saving grace for me. I guess surviving the chemo, I didn't feel like I was alive, and I didn't feel like I was dead yet. I felt like I was somewhere in the middle. And I realized what I was missing all along. And I think that was my saving grace. You know, I found that God was there with me, even when I didn't feel like everybody else was around, you know, like they weren't with me, you know. I felt like I was somewhere in limbo someplace. And it did change my life. Not ever imagining, you know, going through something like that, you know, you walk away from that and have those thoughts, but I almost found it to be like a saving grace.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, there is a phenomenon some people have talked about called chemo brain, and it usually means when your brain is addled because of the chemotherapy, but others say actually you get a clarity because of this crisis. And the things that mattered before don't matter as much, and the things that should matter matter more. And by the way, I don't think anyone should have to go through a terrible therapy or a car accident or something like that to have that realization. But it can be an outgrowth from it. For me, there are other ways to get to that realization. One is through prayer, and another is through meditation. But those aren't easy either. I mean, they're different than accidents, but they're not easy. But whatever can get you, you know, they say that religious people sometimes believe in hell. Spiritual people have been through hell, right? Sometimes it's the struggle that makes us humble, that makes us realize we're not everything, but we're also not nothing, right?
That's right.
We're a little more than our place and a little less than our space, or however the idiom goes. But that balance, that awareness is so important. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Rabbi, I wanted to take this opportunity for thanking Beth Shalom for saying yes. And that was saying yes as we gathered supplies for the victims of Hurricane Laura. Your synagogue made a tremendous outpouring of service in supplying actually almost a full load going out in our 3 loads that we made. You folks supplied almost a van full of very needed supplies to the victims over there. And it's an example of Woodlands and the interfaith community. And we certainly thank you for saying yes to that.
Well, thank you, Jim. I have to say that it was a great honor for the congregation to do so. And Helen Richards, who's on the call with me, we were at the building when everyone dropped it off, and people came to the building for another reason. They were getting supplies for the High Holy Days. So not everyone came to the building to drop off stuff. We thought maybe only a few people would, because it wasn't the purpose of the drive-through. But it seemed like every car had more and more stuff. It was like in the book of Exodus when the people are told to bring things for the tabernacle, and Moses has to say, "Stop, you're bringing too much." When does that happen? But that happened. So thank you for that opportunity. It was, there's an old saying in the rabbinic literature, the Talmud, more than the calf has to suck, does the mom have to provide the milk. In other words, as much as the need was great, I think a lot of our communities just want to be with people and help, right? I was reading about someone who got the first stimulus check, and what did she do with it? She gave it all away to different shelters. It was more important to give it away than to receive it. So, I think this pandemic has created, on the one hand, abilities to have Zoom lectures and services and things like that. But I'm not worried that once we get out of this, we're going to stop wanting to meet in person. I think actually this might make it even more important to meet in person, because I'll tell you one thing that is, I think, physically true. As wonderful it is to see your faces, and you can see my face, it's not the same thing as actually being together. And I think human beings need to have face-to-face meetings. It's a physical thing, and we're missing it. And we'll be excited to go back. So we'll have to say no to other things so we can say yes to this thing. And it reminds me, there was a professor at Kellogg School of Management, a different professor than the one who gave that quote, who was telling a story about how he ended up meditating seriously once a year. He was a very busy executive, but once a year he would go with a group of guys and meditate in silence for a whole week. One time his wife said, "Honey, I know you do this always the third week in October. It's a really busy time with the family. Can you change to another week?" And he said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because these are all my friends. We're such good buddies." She said, "You've never spoken a word to any of them." But the sitting together made them feel so careful. And he really learned this lesson about providing that time for things like that. If you're not thinking, then you're not deciding what your values are. And if you're not knowing what your values are, how are you going to live your life? And he would talk to friends and they would say, "Boy, it's great the way Harry, here's his name, you can do this. I wish I had time." He said, "Well, you have time." He said, No, I don't." "What do you mean?" "Well, my weekends, I'm just so busy." "Well, what are you doing?" "Well, I play golf for 4 hours every day, and then I've got the football games." And Harry Kramer said, "Those are wonderful things. If you want to do something else, you're going to have to say no to that sometimes." Right? We all have 168 hours a week, my friends. That's it. I don't care if you've got the vaccine or not. I don't care if you're rich or you're poor. It doesn't matter. We're all democratically equal, so to speak, D with a small d, when it comes to time. So if we're not making choices about what we're going to do by what we're not going to do, then we're really not in control. We're not steering at all. We're just drifting.
Does anyone else have questions for Rabbi Goldberg?
Rabbi, my name is Shirley. I just wanted to thank you because tonight, as you talked, I had never thought about God making room for me by diminishing himself in some way. What you've done is expanded. I barely understand what it means that God loves me. And I know he does. It's just that it's a difficult concept for me to understand. And you added a whole new dimension to what love means.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. And I hope it's something we'll all think about. Because hopefully with a book like this or a presentation, it doesn't stop when we say goodbye, but you'll continue to think about it. And by the way, there are podcasts. One's called Essentialism, where the host interviews someone each week, a different person, very successful people who have become successful by saying no a lot. And again, it's not someone who says no to be mean, right? It's not someone who says no because they're on a power trip. It's a quiet no. So we can say yes to what matters most. So there are many of them out there. There are books. When I wrote this book, there were fewer books. Now there's more on the subject. But I think we're onto something. It's sort of the Marie Kondo of the spiritual world. We have to let go of things if we want to have room for the things we treasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Rabbi Goldberg, and thank you for being such a great friend to St. Simon and Jude. Again, everybody, his book is available on Amazon.com. There's a link on St. Simon and Jude. You can go directly from there. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And again, have a great evening, everybody. Stay safe, and God bless all of you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.